So how long have you been working in this field?
I have been working in this field for 35 years, and then I've been teaching for the last 7 full-time. So
Awesome. What made you want to switch into teaching?
a couple of things. One is that you get to a point in your life where you want to give back and you want to be able to influence people. And I enjoy being able to share that information. It was not as freely shared with me because a lot of people in the industry, I think, are afraid of competition. So I like being able to share that information and give people some insight. And then also the industry is constantly evolving. So I got to a point in my life where I had to evaluate from a business standpoint, was it feasible for me to invest another $250,000 into equipment? Am I going to see a return on that investment? And so those things kind of come into play. Where you have to decide, all right, so at a certain age, you run into some things like, just trying to pick up my light case. My light case was like 65 pounds, and just moving that stuff around was starting to be a little bit cumbersome. So I either had to change my role and just be a director and not have to worry about all the equipment. But I like doing the whole thing. I like seeing it from script to screen. I like to be part of all of those things. And so that was going to involve an investment in more equipment. So cameras, new lights, those kinds of things, monitors. So there was a financial consideration in terms of return on investment. And I'd already spent, good $500,000 on equipment. So I'm like, I'm not sure I want to spend another $250,000.
Yeah,
So
awesome. So you spoke about some of the resources not necessarily being available to you when you were a student. Tell me how you think things have changed from the time that you were a student or even just starting to get into the field versus being a student now or just starting to get into the field now.
Sure. The industry is very different now than it was when I got into it. Traditionally, the industry has always been I would say, an apprenticeship type of program where you would go work with somebody and you might work in that position for 15 years before you actually moved up. And so with an apprenticeship setup, you have to get into that industry and then just spend a lot of time getting there. Today, that apprenticeship can be condensed considerably by going to a program that offers the education and the equipment access that you're going to need to learn how to use those tools. I would say that today, from an educational standpoint, there's depending on the program, there are more resources within the program. They have better equipment. They have more equipment. When I went through the program, I did very little. They had like one camera. There was very little access to equipment. I don't even think they had audio gear. And they didn't have digital editing systems. Nowadays, like our program here supplies students with all of the software to be able to do that. That didn't exist when I was in college. In fact, I had to learn it all as a professional independently. And so I think that there's more opportunity now to walk into the industry prepared. And the industry is actually saying that they have that expectation. I've been to some conferences in the past, and all of them have said, we expect any intern or entry-level student or employee coming into our organization to have a pretty solid set of skills. It's no longer, I'm just interested in, can you teach me from the ground up?
Yeah. So when you were speaking about your professional career, do you have any moments or highlights that stood out, maybe a favorite project that you had worked on?
Well, there's a couple things to answer that question. Number one, when I got into the industry, you think about, it being this glamorous. A lot of people think that that's a very glamorous occupation, and you do meet a lot of influential people, and I think that's a great side of it. And that to me was the most interesting part, was that I met a lot of people in different walks of life that I would never have explored had I not been in the industry. So I know a lot about everything now simply because of doing interviews like this, where you hear the whole backstory and you hear everything about what that industry or what that universe is all about. And so, to me, I think that that's been very compelling, and that's been the most rewarding side of things. The other side of it is that I've been able to experience things that very few people get to experience, simply because of the type of industry that I'm in. And so an example is I spent 6 weeks in Antarctica. I mean, we went to the far side of the Antarctic and came out in Perth, Australia, which I think 0.1% of the world's population has been to that part of the Antarctic. And it was all expense paid. So I didn't have to invest anything in order to be able to do that. I actually had the opportunity to go do that without any expense on my part. And so those kinds of things, I don't think you can buy. I've met some of the most influential people in the world, and been in their homes, and where are you going to get an opportunity like that? So those things have been very, very exciting. I've traveled around the world doing this, and normally it would cost a lot of money and a lot of I guess preparation in order to be able to do that, if you just wanted to do it on a more of a travel basis or something like that. So I think it's really cool. I mean, I've stayed in some of the finest hotels in the world. I've done interviews in all of these hotels, so that's what we're doing. And I've met some of the most influential actors and presidents of the United States. I mean, it's really neat to meet people like this and realize why they're in those positions. This doesn't happen by chance. Most of these people are extremely intelligent. It's really, really fun to be around people that have that capacity. You meet somebody like Bill Gates, and you're like, okay, I can see that you're way ahead of me. And so that to me is humbling, but it's also exciting because you can learn a lot from those people.
Yeah. So going back to when you were speaking about your time in Antarctica, what were you doing there?
This was a documentary on emperor, or all kinds of penguins, but then when we were in the deepest part, it was emperor penguins. So we were doing a documentary on those and seals and different types of birds. And so the way that this came together is that there's a population of people that are what I would call stratospheric welt. And what they do is they spend their entire lives going on one expedition after the next. That's all they do. They're going around the world on these ships. And these ships are like, the ship that we were on was an icebreaker. And so it looked like a Holiday Inn on a barge. Very tall, very shallow hull. And these people were going down there so that they could check a bird off their list. They were like, a hobby of ornithology, and so they wanted to go down to check off a snow petrel that can only be seen in the deepest parts of Antarctica. And so it was really kind of neat. We went down there. There was a helicopter. We'd fly in, and then we would hike in from there to the rookeries. And so we were doing this documentary, but it was really interesting to be around people that were flying in that stratospheric circle. I never realized there was that level of wealth. I mean, where they think that doctors are like bottom feeders, doctors and lawyers. They're like, okay, and you only get there through inheritance, A similar situation was I spent a week with Anne Rice, who did an interview with a vampire, interviewing her entire family. And the thing that was interesting about that was that her husband was very, very wealthy. And they lived in a part of New Orleans where you can't buy these houses. This, again, is stratospheric wealth. I mean, you just inherit this stuff. And the funniest quote that I heard her husband say was that Anne Rice grew up on the wrong side of Magazine. Well, Magazine Street is nothing but these mansions. So I can't imagine one side being more influential than the other, but that was the mentality. And she ended up becoming much more successful than even he was. So just being around that, to me, it's mind-boggling, to realize that people can live in those kinds of lifestyles. But we watch it on TV all the time. That's what we're interested in with Downton Abbey and those kinds of shows. It's like we want to see people that are living that kind of life.
Yeah. So while you're filming this documentary, what was your role? And then what would a kind of day in the life of your role look like?
That's a great question. So Antarctica is one of the poles, basically. And so when you get down into that Arctic circle, the day changes significantly. And so what we were able to do when we got down there, since most of these people that were down there were photographers and they wanted to get a photograph of these birds, we could set our day to start whenever what we wanted. So we basically followed when the sun was best for photography. So that was the first step of things. And then we would, in the morning, I would pack up the gear. My role was to do sound. And the person I was going down with was a documentary filmmaker. And so we were shooting on Super 16, so it was film. A little different kind of a setup than shooting on video. We had to have a lot of safeguards against freezing equipment because the temperature down there is extremely cold. We were down there in the summertime in Antarctica, but it was still, I think 28 Fahrenheit or something like that was the warmest it got. And so we had heat packs that we put on all the equipment to keep it from freezing up. And we even had Microforce controllers for the camera. After about an hour of shooting, they'd still freeze up. And so my role, again, was audio, but there's only 2 people on the shoot. So I'm also responsible for helping to transport the equipment. The gentleman I went down there was considerably older than I was. So we would go down there. We would have our time slot that we would fly in. So we'd get in the helicopter would fly us into the rookery, we'd get out, we'd put all this gear on a sled, and then we would haul it out to the rookery. We'd set up, we would shoot interviews, we'd shoot a bunch of B-roll of the various birds that we saw, or seals, or whatever that situation involved. And then we would pack it all up and we'd have to hike back. And we'd have to also, an important thing about being in Antarctica is that you have to wear layered clothing, because if you sweat, the sweat will freeze. And you have to be very careful about whiteout situations. In fact, we had a couple of those. And so as we would hike in, you have to actually run almost like a fluorescent orange markers along the way, so that when you get in a whiteout, you can't see 2 feet in front of you, and you have to follow these markers back to base camp so that you could then pack in at base camp and survive the temperature change. And in fact, while we were down there, a photographer at one of the ice bases died, a very well-known nature photographer, because he went out shooting and a whiteout situation happened and he couldn't find the base. And when he was 100 yards from the base when they found him, but he couldn't find the base. And so those were considerations that you had to take into play. So that's what the day was like. We would go out and shoot, and again, we're loading magazines in, so we had to take all these magazines of film. So my role was sound, but my role was actually more like everything except shooting the picture on that particular thing. But it was really, really amazing. And we tested out a lot of different microphones to find out which was going to be the best, because it is absolutely silent down there. There is no noise whatsoever, and so you can use some very high-end equipment. I was doing a lot of stereo recording with the rookeries, where you can use stereo mics and determine what kind of panoramic sound you wanted, record that stuff, as well as doing interviews, and then pack it back in, come back to the ship, and wait till the next day or the next location.
Yeah. So you spoke a bit about meeting influential people,
Yeah.
and having these incredible experiences like Antarctica. What gives you the fulfillment, or what has been your favorite part of working in this field?
Well, this industry is all about delayed gratification. So this isn't something where you're just suddenly going to get a rush when you're out there doing it, because you're working really, really hard, no matter what capacity you're in. There's a lot of pressure to try to make the shoot successful. There's a lot of money invested in doing that, and if there's a failure at any point, it could jeopardize the entire project or your relationship with the client. So when you're doing it, I mentioned, or let's put it this way, it seems like a glamorous job, but you're always working really, really hard. And the payoff, the gratification, comes when you see fruition of the project, and you see it on television, or you see it in a movie theater, or you hear it on the radio, whatever part of that you're doing. That fulfillment comes from, the gratification comes from seeing your stuff published. And So to me, that's the payoff, but it's so far after the fact that it's you're in a whole different project. So it's like this momentary gratification thing, but I think it's a healthy gratification. It's not one of these things. Life isn't about a rush every minute, I think that we're in a time where a lot of people are going from gratifying moment to gratifying moment to gratifying moment, and they're going through them so quickly that they don't actually get any sustainable satisfaction out of it. It's not fulfilling to them. It's kind of like binge watching a movie series or a TV series, because you watch the whole thing, and I've asked people many times, do you feel a sense of fulfillment after spending a weekend binge watching? And everyone has said no. So I think that idea of working hard, seeing the fruition of the work, and then having that time, because it takes time, you have to live that process, and then when you see the final product and you experience it being, broadcast or published in some way, that is a very gratifying moment that sustains you for a long time. So.
Yeah. So just to tie it all up and maybe look to the past, what would you say was your decision to go into this field?
That's a very interesting question as well. I think we start out life with an idea of what we want to do, and we have a career path. And then I think that you end up going through lots of different avenues and roads and bends while you're trying to reach that. So for myself personally, my first interest was in music, and my interest was in doing scoring. Well, when I got out there, I found that there was very little opportunity for that type of work unless you were very extremely talented, which I wasn't as talented as some of my friends were. And I think you're just born with that. Some people are just born with an innate ability to do something, and the most beautiful thing that can happen is when you're born with a talent and you also want to do that type of work, that's when we get these great people in the world that we all aspire to be. But for myself, I started out seeking that and trying to do scoring, but not aside from talent, I wasn't living in an area that had a high demand for that type of work. And so that led to a phone call one day where somebody said, hey, can you do sound for television? And I said, well, I've never done it, but I've been using mixers all my life, and I understand the process, so yeah, sure. And that led then to me working and doing sound for, about 12 years in the industry, and very successful in that regard. And in doing that, then I learned how to do cinematography, because a crew is basically a camera person and a sound person nowadays, unless you're doing a feature film or something like that. And so I was able to learn the video side of things on the job, just watching people and getting a chance to work with, I would say, out of all the people, the probably 100, 200 people I work with, there was a handful of people that were really, really excellent at what they did. And so I would observe what they were doing, and I would see the equipment that they purchased. And then I started acquiring some of that equipment. So the other factor that comes into this is that no matter what we want to do in life, unless we have the opportunity, it's very difficult to do that. And some of that is governed by finance. So in order to get into the camera side of things, when I started out in this industry, you had to have about $250,000 to drop right then on a camera and lights and all of the various pieces of gear that's required to do something like this. That's cost prohibitive. I was able to do sound for about $25,000. So I made that investment. I was able to make that back fairly quickly. But then I was also discovering that there was a threshold at how much money I could make in the industry, whereas camera people were making generally twice as much as I was. And so I looked at that and I wondered why, because to me, sound was much more difficult to do than camera. And I say that with the caveat that I'm not discounting the quality of a great cinematographer. What I'm saying is that the possible problems that you would have doing sound seem to be much greater, much more vast than the ones you run to with a camera. So if the camera doesn't work, you're pretty much stuck, right? If the sound isn't working, they expect you to fix it. And so I always wondered why there was this chasm between what you could make as a camera person, and also being a director and those kinds of things. So fast forward to the point that I'm starting to buy equipment. I bought a camera last. I asked these people that knew really what they were doing, what should I buy? And they said, don't buy a camera because the cameras change too quickly. Buy lights and buy glass. And by glass, they meant buy the lenses. And so I started buying those items, and I would rent the camera. And then when I got to a point where I had a client base, then I bought the camera because I knew that I would be able to pay for that camera quickly. So that's kind of how I segued into doing cinematography. And so I did that also for about 12, 15 plus years, actually at this point 20 years. And so that led to doing directing and producing, because when you're doing a shoot like this where there's only 2 people, you're producing it, you're directing it, you're doing everything. And so that led to opportunities to start doing some field production and field directing for shows, and doing music videos and those kinds of things. And that got me to what I really like is being able to do the whole job. So if you're a sound person or a camera person, you're usually a day player. If you're the director or the producer, then you're doing the whole project typically, because you're involved in pre-production, production, and post-production. And so that's what I really like to do. And you don't really have to own anything in order to be able to do that. But I think you also, nowadays, I have to know how to edit. I have to know how to shoot. I have to know how to do sound, because if I'm a director or producer and I'm hiring somebody, I want to make sure that they can do the task that I need them to do, and I know the tasks well enough to do that. Now, there's been many directors that didn't go that way. I mean, I think Alfred Hitchcock was always a director, but again, that gets back to my idea that some people are just born with this innate ability, and I can't, I can't challenge that at all. Those people typically can't teach, though, because they don't know how they do it. They're like, I just do it. And I would ask them, so how do you know that that's the right framing? Well, I don't know. Some of them went to school. I mean, a lot of people will go to school, but again, they just had the talent. So that was my journey through all of this, and I still write music all the way through. So while I was doing all of that, I'm still doing recording studio production stuff. I'm still writing music. I'm still publishing stuff. So it's not like I ever left that passion. It's just that passion did not align with the financial opportunities. So you end up kind of following where there's the path of least resistance, at least for me. Like I said, some people can walk right out of the shoot and they're like, okay, they just start getting directing gigs and they're extremely successful, and they should be, because they're very, very talented. They're just gifted. I have an adage, it's like you're born with talent, but when you're born gifted, but when you actually can make money at it, that's when you're talented. So.
Right. All righty. Well, that's all I have for you today.
Awesome.
Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you, Brandt, and appreciate what you do here at TCC.
Yeah, thanks.